In August of 1958, a historic photograph of jazz musicians was taken in front of a Harlem brownstone. In New York, known as the jazz capital of the world, a large turnout might easily have been expected. In June of 2006, 56 active jazz musicians of all ages and eras met at the Santa Cruz Wharf for a similar historic photograph. Less noticeably than in New York, the jazz scene in smaller towns across the United States, as in Santa Cruz, prospered during the 20th century. Jazz in Santa Cruz County has flourished since the late 1920s, beginning with the popular suite bands and leading into the big band era of the 1930s and 40s. By 1935, a new sound was emerging in jazz. It was much more exuberant and youth-oriented, and it was called swing. That summer, a young band leader named Gil Evans, later to be famous for his work with Miles Davis, brought his swing band from Stockton down to the Capitola Ballroom, just south of Santa Cruz. The band spent weeks fixing up the unused, dilapidated ballroom. On opening night, when all their friends from Stockton led a noisy parade through Capitola, residents threatened to shut the ballroom down again. But the band remained and spent the summer as rivals to the dance bands at the Coconut Grove near the beach in Santa Cruz, which was considered the nightclub of the area. The Coconut Grove continued as the center for jazz in Santa Cruz during the swing era. In the early 1940s, another new sound called bebop was emerging in jazz. It was more oriented towards smaller groups and the virtuosity of individual musicians. This style, developed back east by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, had a strong influence on new young musicians. During World War II and the Korean War years, many musician servicemen flocked from Fort Ord near Monterey up to Beach Street across from the Coconut Grove and to Capitola to play bebop in the many clubs that had sprung up. Santa Cruz remained mainly a resort town throughout the 1950s and 60s. With the founding of the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1965, the emphasis changed, and slowly the town became more of a year-round residential community. The Beach Street jazz scene began to fold as rock and roll music took over in the mid-60s. The fine music programs at Aptos, Socal, and other high schools became the launching pad for young musicians who later studied in a unique jazz program developed at Cabrillo College in Aptos in 1971. Under the tutelage of instructors Lyle Cruz and Ray Brown, the Cabrillo Jazz program won wide recognition. With the cutbacks in revenue for school funding since the passage of California Proposition 13 in 1978, music programs have suffered, and the result has been a noticeable reduction in the quality and quantity of programs offered. Yet, motivated young jazz musicians have found a way to thrive in Santa Cruz. There were many new clubs featuring local musicians and out-of-town groups. Beginning in 1972, Don McCaslin's jazz group Warmth, augmented by many local musicians and out-of-town guests, became a fixture at the Cooper House Courtyard in the center of downtown Santa Cruz. They played at midday, 7 days a week, and some evenings. Then, with the founding of the Kuumbwa Jazz Center in Santa Cruz in 1975, live jazz presentations began another renaissance. The Kuumbwa brought in internationally known jazz artists to perform on a weekly basis and provided a place for young jazz musicians to experience world-class jazz performers firsthand. As the center of the local jazz community, the Kuumbwa, with its close ties to the Monterey Jazz Festival, has acted as a continual source of inspiration for the jazz scene. As demonstrated by the recent achievements of neophyte jazz musicians, the music continues to flourish into this new century.
The Coconut Grove was built in 1907 to replace the Neptune Casino, which was destroyed by fire in 1906. At the time, the Coconut Grove was simply called the Casino. Before 1924, most of the music at the beach was provided by beach concert bands. Then an emerging style of music called jazz started a new dance era. By 1928, bands at the Casino Ballroom began advertising themselves with the phrase, "music by jazz bands." Then in 1932, the big band era exploded, and the era of big band dancing came into its own. In 1934, the Coconut Grove underwent an extensive remodeling and redecorating. The result was a South Seas look and feel. There were 250 real palm trees positioned around the dance floor. That's when it was renamed the Coconut Grove. The Coconut Grove hosted many of the most famous bands as they toured the country. Bands like Paul Whiteman, Lionel Hampton, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Harry James, Woody Herman, Les Brown, and Maynard Ferguson. All these musical greats entertained Santa Cruz audiences. The big band era faded in the 1950s, and by the 1960s, teenage crowds were dancing to more contemporary artists like Sonny and Cher and the Four Freshmen.
Beach Street during the 40s was, I mean, we're talking now the tourist season, of course, but it was lively. I mean, remember, there's not TV. World War II, there were marvelous musicians. I mean, they had regular working groups every night, but also marvelous musicians at Fort Ord in the Army Band. And they would come up probably on their Sundays and, you know, a lot of jam sessions. Lots of people. It was, you know what it's like now. Well, there were lots of people then too. It was a very lively scene. The late great Ralston Brown, who was, you know, an Eckstein caliber singer and drummer, played there at that time, and his piano player he played with was African American. So it was integrated, and I'm sure the jam sessions were too. And he also informed me that they in the San Francisco, Oakland area, blacks and whites had separate unions, and furthermore, there was Van Ness Avenue was the cutoff point, and the African Americans were only supposed to play on one side of Van Ness, and you know the whites on the other side. But he claimed that the band he was in, they broke that down at some time in there, and they played, I think, at the International Settlement, if you remember that place. But anyway, there was that. Definitely the two unions in the color line, but it was integrated here.
The Bamboo Gardens was a club, had living quarters upstairs, the club was downstairs, and the whole front was bamboo. That's why they call it the Bamboo Gardens. It was owned by three brothers, the Mandela brothers, Leo, Vic, and Joe. And they lived upstairs, opened Easter week and closed a week after Labor Day. That was the schedule, 6 nights a week. Double Saturday, double Sunday. Kids would come in off the beach and dance during the day, bring in the sand. Then they'd go, after 6 o'clock when we broke, they'd go home, get all dressed up, come back, and dance on that sand. And it was really kitsch. Nice. Let's go. right here on this very corner was a club called the Beachcomber. It was run by a Greek gentleman whom I've forgotten his name by now, but this is where Big Mama Thornton played. And Big Mama Thornton was exactly what she was, Big Mama, and she was a tough entertainer. In fact, I remember one time a soldier kept bugging her and she hit him in the head with the base of the microphone. Told him to shut up. Right here on this corner. Next to it was the bamboo gardens. And we still got some way to go. This establishment was known as the Casbah. It was owned and operated by Baz Dana and John Dana, who also was a very fine musician in his own right. And they had the waitresses with the costumes, the balloon pants and everything like that. And it was also open in the summer and closed in the wintertime. Worked here in 1953 with Charlie Whitfield.
When I came to Santa Cruz in the early 70s, the only place that we used to play down by the boardwalk was the Beachcomber. And that's because it was part of the Casablanca, which was owned by Frank Leal, who was a studio musician in LA and then had moved up to Santa Cruz and become a restaurateur. So he owned the Beachcomber. And so we would play there every once in a while. But I think by the time I got here, there weren't so many places to play down by the boardwalk for me, you know. I know that there was a lot of activity down there before I got to town, but the Beachcomber was about it for me. Great place because it was owned by Frank Leal, and who went on to own the Bayview Hotel and the 2525. We were very fortunate to have Frank Leal live in Santa Cruz because he was a world-class musician and knew how to run a restaurant and hired great musicians to play and paid them well.
Capitola, which sits just south of Santa Cruz, has long been billed as the oldest resort on the Pacific coast. It has played that role for over 125 years. A camping guide in 1889 complained of the rowdiness among the young people and reported a brass band from one of California's inland towns arriving with female companions and creating noisy merriment pervading the camp until long after midnight. In 1885, the elegant Capitola Hotel was built with adjoining summer cabins quieting down things considerably, even though the seasonal population swelled to thousands. In late 1929, the by now empty and unused Capitola Hotel burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. In 1934, a small dance hall was built called the New Hawaiian Garden, but it quickly failed financially, and parts were salvaged and brought to the empty site of the old Capitola Hotel. This became the home of the Capitola Ballroom, which itself was converted in 1954 into the Seba nightclub, with the Caribbean Ballroom next door. The Seba, with its South Seas decor, presented small jazz groups and jam sessions, and the Caribbean featured big bands for dancing. Now it was the Seba's turn to burn down in 1957, threatening to end live jazz in Capitola. However, the Coffee Cabaret opened in 1958, where Margaritaville stands today. It became the place to go when the clubs on Beach Street closed. At the time, it was the only jazz coffeehouse with live entertainment between San Francisco and Los Angeles. There were house bands from 8 p.m. to midnight. Jam sessions followed, sometimes lasting until 11 a.m. the next morning. That club stayed open for over 2 years, until residents complained of noise and safety issues, and a city ordinance was passed which effectively closed the club. Later, another Capitola coffeehouse, Mr. Toots, presented live jazz as well. And there was more jazz to come.
I was living in Fremont school teaching, so I played mostly in San Jose, but then there was the one spot, and it lasted again only a year or two, but it was a great place to play. Right across from the Penny Arcade, which is now the Beach Street Cafe, was the Opus de Jazz. And the man that ran it for a while had come up from Los Angeles. He had a little money, named James Trillo was his name. He was, he kind of fancied himself as a mafia type guy, and Sinatra and all that. He's a great guy. He hired us to play weekends, and we had a nice jazz gig, and we had jam sessions. And he never paid any of his bills, is what happened. He took the band out to dinner, and he paid us, fair wage for that time, but he just didn't take care of it. So it only lasted a while, but he sold it then to a friend of his named Monk Deanna. So then it became Monk's in the 70s, around the turn of the 60s and the 70s. And Monk also loved jazz. He was a much better businessman. He's also deceased. And then also in the 70s, there was, for quite a while, I had a job at the Crow's Nest. When the bandstand was downstairs, there was no dancing, it was just jazz on weekends. And then the New Riverside on Saturday nights for a long time. The Bayview Hotel, we had week sessions during the week. But the best of all for me was in 1972, Max Walden hired me to play at the Cooper House. And so I got to do that from then until the earthquake.
There was a place called the Cooper House, downtown Santa Cruz. It was an outdoor cafe. A man named Max Walden had bought the old courthouse and turned it into a bunch of shops, commercial shops, jewelry stores and clothing stores and restaurants. And there was an outdoor cafe. And somehow he and Don McCaslin hooked up, and Don started a band down there called Warmth. This was probably 1972, something like that, 71, 72. So after I got off the road with Jimmy Witherspoon, I wanted to play jazz, and there was a perfect opportunity for me to play jazz down at the Cooper House. So I went and sat in one day, and before you know it, I was playing 7 days a week down there for lunch. The tourists just loved it. They could sit out there in the sun. We would play 7 days a week, 365 days a year if it wasn't raining.
I sang a lot down at the Cooper House with Don McCaslin and a lot of the local jazz singers and players who were in town. They'd get off the road and we would all go down there between 12 and 3.
Came about, I got a call to come down and play for a political rally on a Sunday. There was no money involved, it was just to support a candidate. And I met Max. He said, I like what you guys are doing. I'm going to put a cafe in here, and if you want to play, So anyway, that was, of course, the most fun I've ever had in my life was getting to do that. So that was all from the 70s and ongoing through the 70s, both day and night. The Cooper House gig, we started at 12 o'clock. And in the beginning, I played every day, 7 days a week, and usually 4 or 5 nights somewhere. But then, I was a lot younger, but we play as long as, we play several hours, and maybe as long as there were people there. We might play 2, 3, or 4 hours. The main musicians would be, in 18 years it would be impossible, but those that played there the longest, maybe, I think Harry Woodward moved here in about 72, and he's still playing with me in 2006, so he's got the, Dave O'Connor's still playing with me, and he played for many years at the Cooper House. The early days, well, Jim Baum played for about 7 years drums, and Bill McCord played for about 7 years. African-American singer Jim Lewis sang from the 70s until he had his stroke, many years.
John Thompson?
John Thompson was there, the painter and conga drummer for many years. Frank Castellanos was there for many years playing congas. Oh gosh, and then there were incredible number of people that played for a while, I named that band Warmth because I was reading a book by a Spanish philosopher named Unamuno, and he said something like, he's not alive so he can't get me from misquoting. He said something like the ancients, light, the ancients cry, but what mankind needs is warmth. And I said, yeah, that's a good quote. Young artist moved here from Los Angeles, or maybe Ventura, Oxnard, down that way. He's still a successful artist, by the way. This is in about 73. And he would come every day. He loved the band and the music. So he talked to Max Walden, who is, I consider, one of the great benefactors of my life, and a wonderful man. But anyway, he talked to him, and Max commissioned him to do a mural of the jazz musicians of Santa Cruz.
He would take photographs of everyone, and then he decided to put it on the side of the building. Well, Santa Cruz City Council or the powers that be didn't like that so much, so he had this vision, and he definitely wanted to do it, so he built a freestanding structure on which he painted this black and white mural, which is very famous.
So he did, and he spent, I don't know, he must have been in town for a year. He didn't work on it every day, but gee, they erected this huge structure, and he had to be up on a scaffold. And well, first he took a lot of pictures, and we got pictures of all the guys that sat in. And if you look at a photo of the mural, you could see all the different people that were really pretty much regulars.
Don McCaslin has copies of it. In fact, I've been trying to get autographs of everybody who was there at the time. Unfortunately, some of them have passed away. I was actually one of the only 2 women that was depicted in this mural. Up there, I'm right to the left of Don McCaslin's head. My hair was very, very curly, and I had my signature hat on, which is what I wore all the time back then.
There were a couple of characters, Ginger, the rainbow lady, that dressed up in kind of Baroque costumes with flowing veils and beat the tambourine, but she was a free form rhythm too. You know, it didn't necessarily relate to the tune, but she was a regular dancing up and down the aisle. She's a wonderful woman. I went to her funeral and I miss her. She was also, she not only did that, but she visited people in rest homes. And, you know, and there was Jerry, the tap dancer that would I'm sorry, he wasn't a tap dancer, he just danced free form. Then we had a tap dancer, I think Bill, he's about 80, he had taps in his heels, and he'd tap, we'd give him, you know, when you play jazz, sometimes you give 4 measures, it was called splitting 4s, we'd give him 4 to tap 4. The most fascinating one to me was Artist the Spoon Man. He would come down and we'd, of course, seize on him to play, and you know, you talk about guys getting into what they're doing, like athletes that play with all their heart and musicians that play with soul. That guy, you know, he played the spoon and he hit himself. If he wasn't bleeding when he got through, you know, it was a miracle. He was just, and he had good rhythm too. Yeah, I think he went on to have some success. And we had the Karamazov brothers doing their regular act right out during the intermissions out in front, and they were, again, they went on to be, you know, very successful. And they were very talented guys. So we had a lot of, there were some others that weren't so talented, but those are some of the highlights. Artists and the Karamazovs and Ginger. Tom Noddy, the Bubble Man, too. Yeah, and he's still going, doing shows. And there was some real talent, wasn't there, in those days? Real talent.
It was a great time. It was coming out of the you know, the late 60s with the hippie movement and everything, and there was that kind of feeling there. And there was tourists that came down there, but during the week when there weren't tourists, it was mostly the locals. They would come out on their lunch hour at 12 o'clock. Of course, they'd had to be back at their office by 1 o'clock, but most of them would stay around and have a couple of glasses of wine and some dinner and a lunch, you know, just eating and enjoying the day. So in Santa Cruz at that time, it was very hard to get anything done because the jazz would be great. It'd be drifting down the street. I came back to Santa Cruz from Los Angeles where I had been, and I talked to Don McCaslin and I said, "What happened to the Mural?" And he said, well, the corporation that bought it didn't like it, so they took a big sledgehammer and broke it up to a bunch of pieces and carted it out to the landfill. And I just started crying. I was just, not only because I was on it, but everybody, all my friends. Luckily, I had a print of it, so I could remember those great times, but I told this to Don McCaslin, and I said, oh my God, what are we gonna do? And Don looks at me and he goes, well, I think it's time for a new mural.
Anything made out of brick was toast after the earthquake. And that's what happened to the Cooper House. It was deemed structurally unsafe and it couldn't be rebuilt. People couldn't even go in to get their stuff after the earthquake. The drummer at that time, Bill McCord, used to stash his drums down in the basement. He lost those. Artists lost their stuff. Retailers couldn't go in to get their stuff. So eventually it just got demolished. You know, a big wrecking ball came in and knocked it down.
I think maybe when I was about 16, I made it into the Cabrillo Jazz Band and started to work with Lyle Cruz and Ray Brown, and that was a wonderful experience.
Lyle Cruz came here to Cabrillo, I think somewhere around 1973, to take over the music department at Cabrillo, and had a very good jazz band, but wanted to start an entire jazz program. And 2 years later, he got permission to create a position for a jazz teacher so he could establish a complete jazz education program. When I got hired here in '75, we established 3 levels of jazz improvisation that occur every semester. We established a beginning jazz arranging class. We established an advanced jazz arranging class. We had 3 big bands at the time. We had jazz history. We also had jazz copying or music copying, calligraphy, which very few schools had. So We've had a complete program in many respects for a good 30 years, and Lyle CRUZ is the reason that that program came into existence. Before I came here, there was a high school teacher named Don Keller, and he had had a pretty nice high school jazz program at in Aptos, which is where our college is located here, but the high school, Aptos High School. And so he had an Aptos High School jazz band that would go on trips to Europe and things of that nature. It was very accomplished, and many of his students started coming up to Cabrillo while they were in high school to take some of my classes, some to play in Lyle's band. And we had a great collaboration going where we got to get some nice students, and Don Keller got to get the result of our teaching up here, so we both benefited very well. There was also a good teacher at Soquel High School named Dave Leitz. He did the same kind of situation. One of my drummers came from Soquel High School, Dave Leitz's school. His name was Jeff Ballard. Jeff was one of my students, and Jeff went on to play with Ray Charles for a number of years, and then with Danilo Perez, and then with Chick Corea. And at this time, Jeff is maybe the #1 person all around New York City, and who knows, maybe the country, and he's such a great, great player and reader. So that's the kind of situation that has led to people getting educated here and then going out and playing elsewhere. Another great drummer was a fellow named Kenny Wallison, and he went to Aptos High School.
There was a serious infrastructure there in terms of schooling, and then combining that with the Kuumbwa Jazz Center opening up in 1975 and getting top flight international bands on a weekly basis performing in Santa Cruz, combined with just the culture here, which was so open and to, you know, art and everything, music, and I felt like there was so much live music going on in Santa Cruz when I grew up, and obviously I was mostly involved with what my father was doing, but there was still a lot of other things going on, and so I was really exposed to music all the time, and that I think was a special thing about Santa Cruz in the area that I grew up in, and I don't know if it's the same way now as much, but in that time when I was here, it was really killing.
The collaboration between high school and college, especially at that time, was very good until Proposition 13 hit California. And then the first cuts that were made to make up for the property taxes were to drama, music, and art programs, and that really hurt our high school and junior high school programs immensely. And it stuck a thorn in our side because we didn't have as many students coming up. Well, there will never be another big band era. Big band era, the 40s and stuff came because of dancing, and that dancing thing was taken over by rock and roll in the 50s. So the whole purpose where those big bands brought in large audiences, such as at the Coconut Grove and things like that, because people came to dance on Friday and Saturday night. There are big bands out there still today, but they are listening bands. Very seldom do you see them playing much for dances anymore, whether it be Bob Mintzer in New York or Maria Schneider or Gerald Wilson. I have my own big band called the Great Big Band that plays at Cumba. Once a year we played at the Monterey Festival, San Jose Jazz Festival, a number of places around. But it's a listening situation. I write all the music for my band, and so it's a place where people can listen to my music that I've written for the band. It's not a dance type of situation. All these opportunities have been available to me because I've been in this town and the surrounding area, maybe the most beautiful place in the country.
Smith played a gig there. the opening of a jazz center called the Kuumbwa Jazz Center back in 1977. Smith came home raving about this wonderful place, this great jazz center, Santa Cruz, where I had never spent hardly any time as a child, but he had, and said he loved it.
I think 74, I started going to Cabrillo. I went back to school. I already had my BA, but I went back to school as a music major, so I took all the classes, you know, the jazz theory classes and some of that stuff. And, you know, I came in contact with a lot of musicians too, and there was no place for these people to really play. I mean, the little clubs where you'd get, you know, a donut and maybe a hamburger or something, and, you know, maybe a little bit of change, but not much. But at least, you know, people were hiring back then. You know, we thought, well, you know, it would be nice if there was some place for a formal place where people could play.
The origins of Kuumbwa started back in 1975. I was in Santa Cruz. I was working at the Crow's Nest, and I had also lived up in Half Moon Bay at my friend Pete Douglas's house at the Bach Dancing and Dynamite Society. And he had some tapes of some live performances there that I was bringing down to play on KUSP. So I met a disc jockey at CUSP, Rich Wills, who did a jazz program in the evenings. And I was playing some of Pete's music there on KUSP and working with Rich. And then Rich brought up this idea that he had about forming a nonprofit jazz society here in Santa Cruz. So he had another friend, a woman named Sheba Burney, who also did some work at KUSP. And Rich organized a meeting of interested folks in like February of 1975. Kuumbwa really was founded on no dollars, $0. We were just a young group of interested jazz fans that had no experience in forming a nonprofit organization or producing jazz concerts or anything. So in order to raise our first money, which we hoped we would use to get our nonprofit status as an organization, we took our stuff to the flea market. And that's really where we had our first infusion of cash. And that helped us to walk the paperwork through Sacramento in order to in those days, it was a little easier to get your nonprofit status. The first concert happened April 6th, I believe, 1975. We wanted to make a statement in the community. I mean, our goal really was to be jazz presenters. So we figured we had to have our first annual Santa Cruz Jazz Festival and benefit concert. And it was going to be out at San Lorenzo Park on the Duck Island stage, where we still do shows occasionally. It featured local jazz groups. At that time, the High Tones were one of the big jazz groups. Eddie Gale, great trumpeter from San Jose, worked with some folks over here in Santa Cruz. Dwayne Everett, who is now known as Dewan Muhammad, had a group called Evidence. There were several good groups that played, and then we were able to get Joe Henderson, the great tenor saxophonist, who lived in San Francisco, to come down and perform. And he brought down Warren Gale on trumpet, and David Friesen was his bass player at the time. And then Jimmy Baum, the drummer, and Paul Nagel, the pianist, both from the High Tones, sat in on those instruments. So it was going to be out there at the park, but it rained.
The drops were like tablespoons of water. So I covered up the piano. I had one other volunteer with me, and the others had already moved. We had the foresight, I guess, even though we were rookies at doing concerts. This is only a month after we had our first meeting. We had a backup location, which was the Laurel School Auditorium. It's now Loudon Nelson, but the auditorium there, you know, held a few people and had a kind of a nice stage, roomy. The volunteer and I, we were flagging down passing vehicles, any truck, and this little Falcon pickup, you know, came by, and the guys were looking for the alternate location. We said, "Oh, we need your help."
Stan Poplin, Paul Nagel, and I hooked up with Paul Contos, legendary local saxophone player, and started a little group called the High Tones. And we played a lot of original music that Paul Contos and Paul Nagel wrote. I think Stan probably wrote some music too. And we played at little clubs around town. We played a little bit more experimental music than Warmth, let's say. You know, Warmth played nice jazz standards and stuff like that. The high tones really stretched out. We were into Coltrane and Miles Davis and Chick Corea and all that kind of music that more avant-garde. We played at the very first Santa Cruz Jazz Festival.
We were just passing around coffee cans for donations, and we had to pay Joe, unfortunately, with a lot of change. I'm sure his bankers were as flustered as he was, but Joe was a decent guy about it, you know.
Probably had about 75 cents left, but at least we put ourselves on the map a little bit and made our name known here in the community. And people could see that we were serious about trying to do something about presenting jazz here. So, and from there we developed several concerts. In the couple of years between when we started and when we opened Kuumbwa here, we were probably doing about 6 to 12 events a year somewhere in the community. The organization was kind of at a crossroads, and we figured that our original vision, Rich's original vision, was to have a home for jazz in Santa Cruz. So we figured we'd better move on that one way or the other because the energy was starting to dissipate a little bit. We were all just working as volunteers. We then found out that the Parisian bakery here at 320 Cedar Street had closed down, and a couple developers had purchased it. And they were going to divide it up. I guess in these days you would call it condoizing it. And we came and talked to them, and they rented us 2,000 square feet here in the bakery, and that was going to be Cocoanut Jazz Center. So we worked for a couple of months. Basically, the building was just a shell. There was no door, there were no windows. In fact, there was only about 3 walls. We had to put one of the walls in. The floor was filled with holes, so we just got a lot of our friends to help us. We used folks that had community service work that, you know, they had to commit to some hours for nonprofit groups. That's how we found an electrician to wire the place. Big Creek Lumber donated lumber to us, and we were able to cobble together a funky little place. And then in May of '75, we opened. The first weekend's concert again featured a lot of our local groups. The High Tones were there. We had developed a relationship with a wonderful pianist from the Bay Area, a woman named Martha Young, who was actually Lester Young's niece. She performed for us. We had met Smith Dobson by that time. Smith performed for us on that opening weekend. And it was an exciting time. We were just young kids doing this, and we made a lot of mistakes along the way, but our hearts were always in the right place, and we worked very, very hard to try and develop a consistency of programming and to have a nice venue. So I think the artists could see that and feel that we were striving and trying for something new, and we were very lucky to have a supportive community.
Here we were, a bunch of white kids in Santa Cruz, white hippie kids, sort of, you know, and you know, we chose the Swahili name. I think, you know, it got around back east. People were like, well, yeah, these white kids are using our language, you know. But it, you know, we just, I mean, James Coleman, you know, was a black man, and he suggested the name Kuumbwa, which, you know, the Oxford Swahili Dictionary at UCS is called it, described the meaning of the word as the act of creation, you know, not the biological sense, of course, but the act of creativity. And we thought, well, that's really what the music is about, you know, because you have standard tunes, you have chord changes and all this stuff, but it's really when the musician is improvising, that's it, you know, it's spontaneous creation of something new. And it is a black music, so we thought, well, you know, it's kind of a weird word, and people, it's really 3 syllables, you know, people say Kuumbwa, but the W is really silent, and it's 3 syllables, so it should be Kuumbwa.
Kuumbwa has changed somewhat over the years physically. And when we opened the venue, the stage was at a 45-degree angle from where it is now. And the room was about a third smaller than what it is now. In end of 1987, we decided that we were going to do some remodeling. We were able to take some space from the building next door, so we knocked a wall out, built a new wall, and then shifted the stage around so we could accommodate the logical floor plan of the building. So that allowed us to get about 50 more seats and have a little more professional presentation. We were able to put in a little bit better sound system. We got a better piano, all the sort of things that that we needed. It was all done kind of on an as-needed basis. What I remember most is not necessarily specific incidences, but I remember artists that come through and what they were like, particularly the artists who have passed away. When Dizzy Gillespie performed here in 1988, he was a fantastic spirit to have in the room. Stan Getz played here several times and was always a real gentleman and really fun to work with. Helen Humes, who goes back to the swing era and vocals, performed here. Teddy Wilson performed here when he goes all the way back to Benny Goodman in the 30s. So some really historic musicians have played here, and they've all had, to one degree or another, helped shape the spirit of the Jazz Center.
I have to give a lot of credit to Tim and all his volunteers and the people that are working there, because they've done a good job in making sure the sound is good, in making sure the musicians are treated with respect and adequately. And that was all part of the original. I think they've held close to the original design, which was to, legitimize the music, because it's still, I can remember hearing an interview with the saxophonist Billy Pierce, and he was going to Central Tennessee State College or something at one point, and this is a black school, right, in Tennessee. And as a musician, he wasn't allowed to play jazz in the rehearsal rooms, It's like they wanted Western music.
Education has always been important to us here at Kuumbwa. In fact, I think one of the reasons that we were successful early on, to go back to kind of this recurring theme that I've brought up, is the fact that our 2 colleges had strong music programs, and I think really gave us the basis for our early artistic support here with some of the great young musicians. So when that started to, not that their programs faltered, but there was definitely a shift in the late 70s and early 80s, particularly in the feeder schools, when music in the schools became less and less. We realized that we had a responsibility to try and keep music happening in all areas of our community. So as far back as 1979, we started our education programs. 1979, we had our Kuumbwa Jazz Institute, which was hosting classes here on a weekly basis. We also had a program where we were taking professional jazz musicians out to schools to do performances. And over the years, we've solidified our programs now to our high school honor jazz band, to our summer jazz camp, to our master class series, and to our artist performance series for young people. So we have 4 programs that are actively involved in bringing music and teaching music to our young people of our community.
Kuumbwa, is basically staffed primarily by volunteers. And to me, it's a really wonderful thing. I spend my whole life working hard, at music and trying to, dig deep, and get to the truth in music. And it's so wonderful to have people out there who volunteer to facilitate a place like Kuumbwa, where there's actually great food, it's a great vibe, they have all these great wines, desserts. It's such a warm place to come play. And a lot of that is to do with Tim and the people who've been there for a long time, John Livingston and Bobby Tadero, these people who run it, but also the people who volunteer there, you know, that the sense of community there, it's really special, you know. I mean, maybe, I'm assuming probably not all these people are jazz musicians. They just do this for the love of music, you know. And that's something that is really beautiful to me. And I see that with my father. I mean, my father is a jazz musician, but my father also has a really deep and great love for the music. On a larger sense, I feel that at Kuumbwa, you know, all these people, the audience, what I was talking about earlier, there's so much joy for the music. Joie de vivre, maybe, you know, they say. I don't know. But it's great, and I love that. And I love that about Santa Cruz. And I think that's something that makes the scene here really special and unique in the world.
Paul Jackson was the bass player with Herbie Hancock on the album called The Headhunters, several albums actually. He came to Santa Cruz in the summer of 1980, and he put together this jazz funk fusion band with about, the band varied from 11 to 15 members at a time. Paul was like an icon at that time. He was the writer of the tune called Chameleon. Boom, 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 da 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 da. So we all knew who he was. We all wanted to play with him, and that's where down at the Edgewater in Capitola was the place to play. And I can remember it was August 24th of 1980, and everybody in town showed up to see this band that we had rehearsed for weeks. It was one of the highlights, you know. I think I said that night, I says, well, if I die tomorrow, I think it'd be okay, God, because, you know, this is one of the highlights of my career. I played with Paul Jackson.
About 1980, 79, 80, I ran into Bobby Payne, who said, girl, you can sing, but you are corny. And he took me under his wing and taught me to swing, basically. And I spent the next 3, maybe 4 years singing with Bobby and Max Hartstein and John Barbera and any number of people who would sit in. Bobby played at Zelda's on Sunday night, and anyone who played in Santa Cruz came in to play with him then. And then we had a gig at the Mansion House for about 3 or 4 years. Bobby came from Chicago, and he had owned a club called the Cotton Club in the 50s. So he knew everyone. He knew Miles Davis and Milt Hinton and Gene Ammons. And so he came from that school. And he taught me, and all of us who were desiring to sing or to play music, that quiet really mattered so that we could hear ourselves, and that laughter was the most important thing. So those are the things that he brought to the stage so that we could hear ourselves, and that it was never about being loud, and that it was always about having fun. And I think he set the tone for a lot of people who continue to play in Santa Cruz today. I love vocalists. We're all a part of God's choir, so I can tell you about the great vocalists that were here in Santa Cruz. Jim Lewis taught me that a lyricist will write the song for the music. All that a vocalist needs to do is articulate. And you don't have to try to do anything other than articulate exactly what the lyricist wrote. And he was right. And Charmaine Scott, of course, is still doing the Motown Express, and Ruby Rudman, and John Lawrence, who was kind of reminded me of Billy Eckstine, but could rock the house with anything that he did. And Windy Day, who at the age of 22 was one of the best singers I ever knew. There were a lot of venues to play in, and there aren't so many now. You could be down in Capitola and go from one club to the next and just jump on the stage and then go to the next one. And you can't do that anymore. Santa Cruz is filled with artists. We're all creative spirits. I always think there's a magnet right off the coast that pulls us here. So we're the same tribe. In the early days, in the 80s, it was very inexpensive to live here. And people could actually be a musician or an artist and not have to work a day gig. If you want to play music, you've got to practice a lot, like thousands and thousands and thousands of hours. So, you know, anyone who doesn't think that is crazy. And also, if I could say that the economics, the pay scale for jazz musicians hasn't changed in the past 35 years. So, you know, I mean, it's ridiculous. And people think that because we have such a good time that we don't need to get paid. Well, you know, it will be reflective ultimately in the quality of the music as time goes along. There has to be a middle ground.
As soon as I met Smith and Gail, it was like we'd played forever. And that only got better as we really did get to know each other so much better. And then with them being here, it was just, I think Smith and Gail and the kids became this sort of center of a music scene, of a big part of the music scene here, because Smith was such a dynamic and loving cat, you know, that he so accepting and so great to work with, and I think that always came through in his performances, and everybody recognized that. So he was a real force in this town while he was with us that I think had a great influence on everything.
Why would someone like Smith of his caliber want to be in a small town situation? But when you're living in that environment and it's so beautiful, you find that you don't have to be in the cosmopolitan communities to be immersed in jazz or immersed in music. We did do a lot of traveling, and I still do. I know Smith, for years and years and years, ran the music in San Jose at a restaurant called the Garden City Restaurant, where he had his jazz series. And he'd be driving over the hill back and forth and back and forth, and it was hard, but to come back to a place as beautiful as Santa Cruz, he felt it was worth it. A great part of living in Santa Cruz and finding a way to make a living and staying in music would be to be teaching. And I know Smith and I always did a lot of teaching, and I still do. And he had a lot of private students, and he also taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he taught the history of jazz, and he had the jazz combos there. You know, it's profound for me on many levels to sit and talk about my history in Santa Cruz, because the person that got us there and the man that was bigger than life in the community, in the music community, was my husband Smith. And the fact that, you know, we lost him in such a way, he was coming home from a gig and we lost him in a car accident. And the fact that I feel like he should be here, he's still here in his legacy, because that's how I live my legacy, is how we live together as a family and a community. And he was such a big part of the community in that way, as far as being this person that tried to teach all kinds of music, not just jazz, but all kinds of music in a joyful way, because that's how he felt about music. And it's sad to me that he's not sitting in this chair telling you what I'm saying, and he would say it in his own way, of course, but I think about him when I'm answering, because what we're doing now, it's been 6 years since he passed away, but my family lives his legacy, which is music and family and teaching our students, our friends, and laughter, and they're all combined.
I always had the idea I wanted to go to New York, but I didn't really want to go from Santa Cruz straight to New York. A great buddy of mine, Kenny Wallison, did that, and he came back, and his report was not so, you know, like, yeah, come on, it's easy. So I thought, let me go to San Francisco. A buddy of mine who I went to high school with called me up and said that Ray Charles is looking for, is holding auditions. So I was at the Monterey Jazz Festival playing with Smith, and Ray was there. And so I went to go see him, and absolutely I needed to go down there and play with that guy. So I went down there, and there were about 7 other drummers down there, and because I could read, thanks to Ray Brown and Lyle Cruz always throwing music in front of us in the band at Cabrillo, we're always sight reading at some point. There's always some new music. So because of that, I could read. And then because of the practical experience as well with Smith and the playing, I had somewhat of a feel too. So I got the gig. And that gig lasted almost 3 years. And then I decided to quit because I wanted to come to New York. So I did. I quit, came to New York. Didn't have much at all, really. Had my my Toyota truck and a long drive and about, man, I think it was like $2,000 or something. I mean, it was nothing. And coming over, this was in 1990.
I felt like I lived here in Santa Cruz my whole life, and it's so beautiful, obviously. And I felt like I needed to be in an environment that was a little more conducive for staying indoors and practicing. You know, it's hard, I tell people it's hard to practice all the time when it's like 70 degrees and you've got your choice of 5 beaches 10 minutes from your house, you know, which was the case out here. So I think Boston was, and I knew it was close to New York, and I knew eventually I wanted to move to New York. So, but I didn't feel like I was ready to go to New York yet, so I didn't really apply to any of the New York City schools. So it was Boston, and my first year, it was really, you know, culture shock going there. When I got to Berkeley, I was really confronted by, there was so many good players my own age on my instrument, but also on other instruments too. And I'd grown up around a lot of talented people, but it was like another level there. It was kind of shocking. It was like, wow. And I think when I first went, I was under the impression of, you know, I'll just go to college and then get a gig and I'll just go on the road and I'll forget college. Like, I don't really want a degree or whatever. And when I got there, I think what dawned on me was that I felt like I needed time to mature as a musician and as a person, and that I wasn't really ready to go on the road right away. So I mean, it was a slow shift, but I think in the first year or two there, I realized, you know what, I think I'm going to stay here for 4 years and get my degree. And I stayed in school, and it was really the right move, because then I started playing with Gary Burton's band before I graduated. He put together a student group my junior year to do like a jazz cruise. But you know, I kind of got the bug to move to New York, and what had happened was I had hooked up Larry Grenadier with Gary's gig, and Larry had moved to Boston, and Larry lived in Boston for a while, and then he was like, man, I'm moving to New York. And I think, you know, hearing him say that, I was like, you know what, it's the right time to go. So I was still playing with Gary, but I moved to New York in January of 1991.
There were a lot of opportunities to play here growing up. Santa Cruz is a very supportive place for that. And when there weren't opportunities, we made our own ones.
Yes.
We actually started playing at the farmer's market and on the street in Santa Cruz, busking. And
yeah, that was the first time we played in public.
Yeah, that was
the farmer's market.
We just played for tips, and we were little, you know, and we still do it now. We played on the street like a week ago, but that was fun. But there are great opportunities. Kuumbwa Jazz Center is especially very supportive.
Well, the transition from Santa Cruz to New York isn't quite as rough as you might imagine, because I think, well, first of all, I think they're two of the most beautiful places to live ever, culturally and otherwise. And it's a very liberal environment where, you know, I think the hippie Santa Cruz vibe fits in very well in New York. But it's a little daunting going to New York, where the jazz scene is really intense, and kind of all these people from all over the world have come together, because it can be a little scary, especially if you think about it in competitive terms. But if you think about it in terms of, okay, I have this gig and it pays this much, and I can hire whoever I want in New York to play with me, then, I mean, people are always down there just trying to make a living there. It's not so difficult to, you know, get it referred from a teacher or get a reference from a teacher and call up, you know, the Strickland brothers or Ari Honig or something. I mean, they're usually down as long as, you know,
as long as they're not touring.
Yeah, as long as they're not busy. It's pretty easy to go from Santa Cruz to New York, I think. The hardest struggle is probably just getting used to the East Coast, you know, attitude.
I think coming to New York, I think the music is so high in New York, not only for its tradition, just the residue of this high tradition, like this big explosion that happened. But I mean, look at it, man. As I said about Santa Cruz being so nice, New York is not nice in a way. It's fabulous, you know. It's amazing. It could be wonderful, full of wonder, you know. It's overwhelming. It can be, but it's not nice. Like, you got to work really hard just to get from point A to point B. You know, walk a lot of stairs to get down to the subway and back up the subway. You know, you're out of breath. You know, you're multiply that times every day, and then the amount of noise that hits you and the amount of smells that hit you, good and bad. You know. There's always something going on, so it's not the best place to live unless you got a lot of money. It's not really the best place for a great life, as I picture a great life, which could be in Santa Cruz. So the music has got to be incredible, because why else would you want to live here? I wouldn't want to live here if I had my choice. But the only reason I'm here is because the music is so heavy.
Sim, sem se descabelar, abriu em mim o sol de verão e encheu minha boca de doce. Me viu sem roupa e riu, e eu nem engoli a barriga.
not that I focus locally. I just focus on my daughters. I focus on, you know, my responsibility of letting them know that there was people caring about them, you know what I mean, that they were somebody to pick them up from school, you know, organize their life somehow, take them to appointments and tuck them to bed and, you know, fix their meals and be a mom, you know. That was my focus. I mean, I did music this meanwhile, but it was my second thing. I don't want to just play gigs and of course that's good, that's beautiful. You develop and so far so on, but I would like to go a step beyond with that. I actually tend to mostly do the music we compose, you know, but I also do, you know, music from the classic repertoire of Brazilian music and bossa novas, but you know, we do it our way, you know. I would start, and those guys are, you know, we can go deeper, you know, in the archetypes, you know, and start completely off the wall. So here I go, I'm in this parallel universe time, and then kind of like I become the storyteller. And sometimes I go in English and I start improvising this kind of into the story, and oh, the ocean and the wind and this, you know, the waves and the coconut trees, you know, going swaying, and here comes, time stops, you know, he looks at her, and so far so on, and suddenly, you know, all those harmonies that are coming, and you know, it's all free jazz, and you know, by the time we get to the song itself, you know, it's already something else that can only be done at that second, because you know, I look at somebody in the audience and they were like this or like that. The whole vibe becomes what's about to be created, you know. So but the trampoline is the song.
I've gotten one lesson with Donnie McCaslin, and he's one of my favorite saxophonists. So that was incredibly inspiring, and I really got a lot out of that. And then. I mean, I've been fortunate to be around other young musicians who are my age, like Remy and Pascal LeBoeuf, were a couple years ahead of me in high school, but they were very successful and at the music, and that was really inspiring for me, as well as my friend Ben Flox has really pushed me, and Hans Bernhard, bassist at USC, who also went to Pacific Collegiate.
Was in 10th grade when I really decided that I wanted to become serious about the saxophone, and I was listening to jazz all day long, not doing anything else, and so I made a compromise with my own school schedule to skip my school periods after lunch and go over to Cabrillo College 2 or 3 times a week and study with Ray Brown, and I think Ray has been the best teacher that I've ever had in any discipline and anything. He's really taught me just about everything I know about jazz music and jazz theory. For a small town like Santa Cruz is, it has an incredible amount of opportunities for young musicians to learn and play jazz and see jazz. When I was younger and just learning about jazz, my first jazz experience was at the Kuumbwa Jazz Center, and they have world-class artists, the best jazz musicians in the world, on a weekly basis, Monday nights, in a little room in downtown Santa Cruz, and it's always packed with people from all over the town, and in my opinion, it's the best jazz club in the world. Not only in my opinion, but I think in most musicians' opinions. Everyone loves to play there, and everybody's so kind and gracious towards the musicians. In addition, Cumba has a jazz camp every summer that I attended for a couple of years. And when I was growing up, that was a great resource.
Right now, I'm in the Kuumbwa High School All-Star Ensemble, which is part of the Cocoanut Jazz Center downtown. And we've gotten some great experiences through that, studying with Terrell Eden, and we've played gigs around town. And I'm also in the San Francisco Jazz Festival's All-Star High School Ensemble, and that's been incredible for me because the caliber of musicians up there, that it's strong from musicians all around the Bay, so that's really incredible. And I've been through that. I've been able to play with Joshua Redman and Dave Douglas and Miguel Zenón and all these my personal heroes, musical heroes. And then I was in the Monterey All-Star, Monterey Jazz Festival's Next Generation Orchestra, and we toured Europe and New York with that, and then I also lead my own group, and which has played at Kuumbwa and a number of different clubs and restaurants around the Bay Area.
Next year I'm going to be attending a program called the Brubeck Institute Fellowship Program, and that program, I was lucky enough to be accepted, is a quintet. It's 5 musicians with saxophone, trumpet, piano, bass, and drums. And the musicians are from all over the world, selected for this one group, and we are the Brubeck Fellows. This is my college, my first 2 years of college. So I'm pretty lucky. I'm going to get to see what life is like as a performing musician. We stay at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, and we live in the dorms there, just like normal college students. But as a quintet, we get to travel around, not only around the state and the country, but around the world, and perform.
10 years from now, I would hope to be living in New York and be writing lots of music and be leading a band and hopefully be as successful as I possibly can. I mean, the ultimate goal would be to be touring and leading my own band where we're playing my own music, which is uncompromised every night.
The day of the shoot, everything's set up and we're just waiting for the musicians to show up, and really about quarter till the appointed time, hardly anybody was here, you know, and that was difficult. That was very difficult. And about 10 till, they just started flooding in, streaming in, so it just turned out great. And for me, I had known ahead of time that I was going to be seeing all of these old-time musicians seeing each other, just as in the Great Day in Harlem movie. Part of that event, a beautiful part of that event, was that all of these musicians got to see each other when they don't normally get to, because they're all on the gigs at the same time. So the same thing happened here. People hadn't seen each other in many years, and that was just so much fun to watch. I really enjoyed that part of it. That was definitely a highlight. And then we had a beautiful day. It just could not have asked for a better day weather-wise. It was just beautiful out here. And everybody got into the picture, almost everybody. We had 2 late arrivals, and they showed up after the shoot was over. Again, you know, it was breaking my heart, but what are you going to do? So the shoot went off perfectly, I would say, and everybody was having fun. And the pictures came out great, and the feedback from all the musicians was incredible. They just loved it.
Hey, I stuck my tongue out. You weren't looking down on the ground level, Mike.
Yeah, actually, I have a little more room. Maybe that'd be good, and maybe the shorter folks way in back, maybe a few can come over here.
The relief at finishing the project was immense on my part. As a musician, of course, I'm aware that people are always coming up to you after a performance of any kind, and oh, that's great, that's fantastic, you were wonderful, you know. And, but there's no doubt about it that when it's the musicians saying this that were part of the picture, it really meant something.
Jazz in Santa Cruz is a really interesting subject. I think it's fascinating that you're tackling it. Obviously, Kuumbwa over the last 33 years has played a major role in that. But there was jazz happening here, I'm sure, going all the way back to the 30s and 40s, and I'm sure it'll continue long after Kuumbwa's gone. So I feel that we're just building and continuing a legacy of artistic commitment here in this community. We're very pleased that the public here is receptive to jazz and is receptive to creative music in general, and hope that we can continue to play a positive role in presenting music in this community and lay the groundwork for all the young people that will hopefully come in the future and keep presenting this music.